Hey everybody, welcome back. It's been a little while since I've done a video or any audio. Took a little vacation with the family, had to get a little distance away from just the everyday of all of this nightmare that we're all living through. But of course, the nightmare never ends, does it? So here I am. I'm right back after vacation is over, and there's so much more to discuss. So happy to be back. Listen, we're going to talk a lot about one specific issue today. I have a friend and colleague and comrade with me to discuss something that we will describe here in a second. But I just want you to know plenty more videos to come about all of the latest developments, the counterattacks in Crimea, what's going on inside of Russia, what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on broadly in the Middle East, how does it relate to the war? There's so much more to discuss. Thank you so much to those of you who have reached out and said, where the hell are you? I need more videos. I need more updates. I appreciate that. It energizes me. Those of you who are supporting on Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitser, you all know how much that means to me. And I have a lot more exclusive videos coming just for you. So please do keep checking back, or I guess not checking back. You get email notifications, whatever. However it works, more videos to come. But today, right now at least, I want to talk about one particular incident that has been dominating the headlines now for almost 24 hours or so. That is the apparent assassination of the daughter of Alexander Dugin. Alexander Dugin, a very prominent far right fascist political operator slash pseudo philosopher slash pseudo political thinker. Dugin has long been called Putin's brain. Dugin has at times liked to allow people to overstate his influence and simultaneously understate his influence. Dugin has been at the center of so much of the ideological questions that have come out of Russia since 2014. And Dugin is really important to understanding what's going on in Russia. How did they come to this point in a war, a criminal war against Ukraine? How did it get to this, and where is it all going? Dugin is a central figure in all of that. He is one of the most prominent fascists in the world today, and his daughter was just assassinated yesterday. So that, of course, raises many, many, many questions and certainly opens the door to a lot of discussion about a lot of different topics. And I literally know no one on the planet more well equipped to discuss those questions with me than my friend Sukant Chandan, who is with me today. Sukant and I go back a number of years. Sukant and I have had a long standing, I don't know, what would you call it, Sukant, blood feud with these fascists who have attempted to create a red
Blood
brown
and
sort
soil,
of.
bro. Blood and
Yeah,
soil.
blood and soil. Thank you. That's right. The Jews will not replace us, and nor
Sorry.
will the degenerate Western liberal order, and so forth. Right. That's the kind of stuff that we've been dealing with. A lot of these Duginists hate our guts, and that is just fine. So anyway, Sukant, you're back with me. It's been so long since we recorded any of our chats. So welcome back.
Thanks, brother, comrade Eric Draitser. Good to be back, and I just like to offer you and our audience flowers and sweets today. Not because we revel in the passing of anyone's life. It's not about that, but the amount of destruction and racist violence that Dugin and his global racket have deposited into our world, and the countless racist attacks that's happened on the basis of that. It's just today with the targeting of Dugin that's killed his daughter, who was also a very important fascist operator in the global Dugin racket. It's just it's a case I think of Dugin's global fascist war coming home to hit him directly in the face. And I make no apologies in saying that it's a day that we have to recognize that it's an important hit back at this global fascist racket, which is a joint enterprise on Dugin on the one hand, who's been basically green lighted for quite some time by the Putin leadership, although what's happening now we're not sure. But on the one hand, you got Dugin's global racket that's fused into this symbiotic relationship with the leading elements of the Western far right in the form of Trump and MAGA and Steve Bannon. And there's lots of kind of evidence we can give to that through our conversation. So yeah, just going back to the incident today, it's really important because anyone who's interested in fighting racism, in fighting white supremacy and far right ideas, the Dugin racket has to be defeated in that. So yeah, it's an interesting moment.
Indeed, an interesting moment. And since you just mentioned it, I think it's important for us to highlight, and you can comment on it if you want, Sukant. But the fact is that we have to push back against any attempts at framing this incident as some kind of sympathy inducing incident for Dugin, right? That it's not that Dugin is some fascist who was targeted and oops, by the way, they struck his innocent daughter. His daughter was in her 30s, I believe, a virulent fascist in her own right, somebody who has publicly called Ukrainians subhumans, who has talked about, all of the kinds of political, I mean, what could we call it? Nazi sort of ideas that her father has put out there in the public space. She not only co-signs on all of them, but in fact, in some respects, is maybe even was more effective ambassador for those kind of ideas than maybe even her father was. So it's not like some innocent young girl got killed here.
Dara Dugin was definitely positioning herself to take over the leadership of her father's global racket. But you know, if we look at the Christchurch shooter, that's Brenton Tarrant, who killed 51 Muslims at I think two mosques in Christchurch several years ago. If you look at his manifesto that he published just before committing his horrific crimes, it fits very neatly and harmoniously into the Dugin framework. It's about workers' control, environmentalism, traditionalism, etc., admiring China and Russia, etc. If you look at, and this is someone that leading Duginists were basically being apologists for, not least Mimi Laham, otherwise known as Partisan Girl on social media. And Mimi is one of the most important Duginist kind of activists globally as well. And we'll come to some other of these personalities probably in the conversation. We go back to Carl Rittenhouse, the shooter against our comrades in the United States 2 years ago. Again, you got Mimi Laham there, just openly defending Carl Rittenhouse as well. So the politics of Duginism, which is basically just very kind of old school Nazism and far right politics, it's been deposited right across the world. And even in terms of trying to develop the potential of the radical left, which is anti fascist, anti racist, anti imperialist, and pro socialist, etc., our challenges are made even more greater by this whole global fascist racket. So, for example, with the Julian Assange campaign, now he's a controversial figure, but nevertheless, it's people like it's the Duganists who are utilizing things like the Assange community to constantly sabotage any chances of our politics having any legs going forward. So it's a combination of depositing some really kind of politics of sabotage from the far right, encouraging violent racists as well, who are conducting attacks that we don't know about, but also very infamous historic attacks as well against racialized people. I mean, this is why it's a primary necessity to defeat the politics of this camp.
And we've seen it emerge in several contexts. Of course, the obvious one today is in the context of Ukraine. Those who would be in what you might call the Duginists' camp are the ones who make apologies for Russia, if not outright defenses of Russia. The Duginists, of course, going back several years, Syria was the primary issue where you found elements that were within these Duginist networks that essentially allied together and tried to convince people on the left that, hey, these people on the far right are actually your comrades and you should be aligning with them over issues of international solidarity and so forth. It was, as you said a few minutes ago, an attempt to sort of create a unified network of red, brown, left, and right elements that could essentially do whatever they needed them to do to toe the Russian, the sort of the Kremlin line.
Yeah, I think at a particular historical juncture, of which I think we're coming to an end now, that racket was quite successful. It's falling apart now at the seams as a result of the fallout of the Russian war and occupation of Ukraine. Now, I mean, I mean, we have a common history here, Eric and I, in terms of the falling out with this camp in around circa 2016. I mean, I knew about the National Bolsheviks and this red-brown politics. I'm 44 now. I've known it since my late teens. But really, in terms of Alexander Dugin's role in all of this spontaneously really comes to my attention through the events of 2015 and 2016, at which time both of us were going onto the Russia Today news channel in inverted commas, and Russia Today or RT was pushing out this anti-migration line, which is to say this far right argument that migrants from outside of Europe are just culturally they culturally cannot fit into Europe, so they must be ejected out and kept out of Europe. So I'm thinking, well, what's going on here? Where is this exactly coming from? Now we know that the Moscow leadership has been espousing this kind of politics for a while, but why is it coming? Why is it now at the fore of their narrative? And what's going on there? What's the root of it? And the more you dig, the more we actually understood the personalities involved that we respectively knew. You knew some people more than I did in this Duginist racket. We realized, oh, it's coming from this guy Alexander Dugin. Dugin is the one who's actually controlling this kind of this soft power strategy from the Moscow leadership. He's actually managing a lot of the politics that's being espoused from the editorial line of Russia Today and the connected kind of media industry. So it was really a spontaneous kind of development, whereas that myself and yourself, Eric, and just a few other comrades are just trying to really critique and work out what's the root of this, and then starting to counter that at the time. That's just to say that I've never really been that really interested in Dugin, and he didn't really come across my political horizon until the so-called migration crisis, which itself was manufactured. This whole concept of the migration crisis was manufactured by the joint enterprise that we see between us, which is on the one hand the global Duginist kind of industry fusing together with Western far right elements, both within the governments in terms of Trump and Boris Johnson, and also others like Viktor Orban, but also at the far right grassroots.
There's so much that we need to talk about to try to let people into the last 7 years of this very minutia, and to use a very U.S. centric term, what we would call inside baseball of all of this, very obscure stuff. But to keep this relevant for our general viewer, let's just return really quickly to what's happened today, yesterday, and today, and let's talk a little bit about what we think are some of the ways of interpreting this, and why certain elements, both pro and anti-Duginist elements, would interpret it in different ways. So I would submit to you, Sukant, and I would ask you to comment that there are essentially three potential theories for what's happened here with regard to Daria Dugina, his daughter, and Dugin himself. The first theory, which is the one that is clearly being espoused by the Dugin sycophants and the various other fake journalists who, sort of represent Dugin's both left and right manifestations. Their line seems to be, at least in the 24 hours following this incident, that this was clearly and unmistakably a US, NATO, and or Ukrainian operation, that it was in various ways a sort of escalation by the West in their continued assault against Dugin on the one hand, but Russia more broadly. That is, let's call it bucket number one, or theory number one. Theory number two is that there are domestic opponents within the nationalist camp in Russia who saw Dugin as, in various ways, an enemy, a foe, an obstacle, or what have you, a problem in some sense, and that they moved against Dugin to eliminate him, and maybe inadvertently got his daughter. Maybe they intended to get both of them. Who knows? But nationalist elements from within the Kremlin and or within the Russian security services and the state. And the third, I think, theory here would be Putin himself and or the circle around Putin actually directly acting against Dugin and ordering the hit on him and or his daughter. And this theory, I suppose, would hold that either Dugin has outlived his usefulness for Putin, or Dugin had, in various ways and for various reasons, become a problem for Putin, a problem that needed to be eliminated for whatever possible reasons those might be. Now, I think there's probably elements of this whole story that could probably lend credence to several different theories, including ones that I may have not mentioned. But I just want to throw those out there and ask you to comment. What are your thoughts in these first 24 hours? How do you view what's happened with regard to Dugin and his daughter, and relative to, and this is where I really want to go, the global situation? What, if anything, do we read into the Ukraine situation and other issues from this?
Yeah, thanks for that, Eric. I mean, out of those two, three scenarios, I mean, we don't know, obviously, and we've got no hard evidence, obviously. But out of those three, I think the third one probably makes most sense to me. That this was a covert hit done by Putin himself, and it's a complicated conversation. There's lots of complex elements involved in here, but just to try and summarize, Dugin is a major loudmouth. He's just, he thinks he probably thinks he is the Russian leadership, and he kind of thinks, if you listen to the way Dugin speaks publicly and advocates publicly, it's like he's leading Vladimir Putin, not that Vladimir Putin is leading Dugin. He talks down to Vladimir Putin. He patronizes him and condescends Putin openly. I think he's got such a massive opinion of himself, Dugin. And for someone like Putin is the guy at the head of the table, the long table, as we saw. Um, he's the guy at the head of the long table, not Dugin. Dugin is just some, like, ragtag little prick on the side. Excuse my language. As far as Putin is concerned, so Dugin is useful in as much as he's useful to Putin's project of the last decade to 2 decades. He's a national Bolshevik pioneer and leader. He's helped to develop this soft power global industry, which is promoting this traditionalist, conservative, far right politics. But in the case of the Ukraine war and the Ukraine situation generally, Dugin is really obsessive about Ukraine and has been for a very long time now. I know on social media people are quoting him when he made a speech as a professor at one university. This is quite some time ago. I think this is circa 2008, where he's saying, we have to kill Ukrainians, etc. This very kind of Russian supremacist, white supremacist attitude
And just and
from.
just to be clear, Sukant, just to interject for those people who this is a difficult entry point if you don't know who Dugan is at all, because we're getting into some finer territory here. But
Hmm.
just so that people understand, Dugan's politics is not only a fascist politics; it is a politics of Russian imperial revanchism. He sees Russian imperialism as not only a force for good, but as essentially natural and necessary in the Eurasian space. And so all attempts to have any kind of independence in the post-Soviet landscape, he sees as a direct assault on what Sukant was talking about, tradition, but also just the glory of the Russian Empire. So when we're talking about Dugin, we're talking about a kind of politics that is both fascist in its orientation and in its manifestation, but also rooted in and driven by a Russian neo-imperial or revanchist ideology. I just
Oh,
wanted to interject
yeah,
that.
very much so, and very explicitly so. When you listen to Alexander Dugin, he doesn't pull any punches. I mean, I'm surprised he doesn't ask for the reestablishment of the Tsarist monarchy like Solzhenitsyn did for so long. But anyway, that aside, so I think for Putin, Dugin was useful. He helped set up Russia Today and this all these other little connected cottage industries of media platforms and social media, etc. But that all comes crashing down with the Ukraine war. Russia Today and the other Moscow platforms get either deleted or severely curtailed by Western-controlled social media. So the Dugin camp becomes this really awkward kind of ship of itself that Putin has kind of launched, but then it kind of Alexander Dugin thinks he's kind of like really kind of like overblown his role when it comes to the Ukraine war, and Dugin is constantly basically lambasting Putin and Putin's leadership with the Ukraine war. Now, the Ukraine war isn't going the way that Putin thought from the get-go of the war. And so you got this really awkward situation where, especially with the now 4 day consecutive days of bombing Crimea and all the optics that look so disastrous for Putin, i.e., Russians running away under Ukrainian bombing of Crimea. I mean, Putin was supposed to to grab Crimea, be its savior, show Crimea off as like the citadel of what's beautifully possible of this new Russian revanchism. And now here you are, Russians cowering under Ukrainian bombs and running away in droves, in making big traffic jams on the highway. Now, and
Which, by the way, I would add lends credence to the idea that we're going to see a major Russian escalation in the next few days in response to this because of how disastrous that looks. But anyway, we're recording on August 21st. We shall see in the coming week what kind of Russian response we see. But go ahead, Sukant. Sorry.
yeah, so I mean, and so then it just seems really awkward, and we know because Putin has launched this new wave of irrational nationalist fervor and emotion uh, in direct relation to his war and occupation of Ukraine. What that does, it makes all these nationalist factions circling Putin even more mad, and they're vying for influence and power. And Dugin thinks he's got a natural right to be at the top of that pyramid. And it's just all very awkward. So I think it makes sense for Putin, who really wants Dugin and that entire industry that Dugin leads, and that industry is very loyal to Dugin as well. It's probably more loyal to Dugin than it is to Putin in terms of the Duginist global racket. So Putin probably want to think, well, this is really awkward. This guy's annoying. And if now Putin, as is probably likely, yeah, there might be escalation, but also at the same time, there might be moves to try and negotiate something from the Moscow leadership in terms of the Ukraine war. If there is any kind of negotiation from Putin in relation to Kiev and its NATO backers, then people like Dugin will scream sellout, basically. And does Putin want that type of irritation? Of course, he doesn't want that. The other big factor here is, I think, apart from NATO and the illiberal, degenerate West, quote unquote, that Dugin and the Moscow leadership call the West. Um,
Don't forget transgendered. Don't
Transgender. I
forget
mean,
their
listen, bro.
transgendered, degenerate, liberal world
I
order.
mean, they're dying just to call it Jewish Bolshevik.
Oh,
Like,
100%. Oh, they're just, yeah, they have to fight every urge to throw that in there. Go ahead, Sukant. Yep.
uh, but so Dugin's main foe when it comes to his politics and his Eurasianist project is actually Erdogan. You know, and Erdogan, he's a scumbag, he's a backstabber, he's a hypocrite, he's all of that, but he's a very sophisticated operator who's the leader of an ancient entity, which is Turkey, which is the leader of the Turkic peoples, the whole neo-Ottoman thing, and Putin can't but do deals with Erdogan when it as he pushes awkwardly into the Ukraine war. So Erdogan has quote unquote helped Putin negotiate with the Ukrainians to release the grain shipments, etc., from the Ukrainian ports. Going forward, Putin is obviously leaning heavily on Erdogan to achieve certain machinations in terms of the Syrian government as well. And all of these things, Dugin won't like at all. Again, does Putin want someone moaning publicly like Dugin when he's trying to maneuver in this way? No, he doesn't. The other two scenarios that you mentioned just don't make any sense. If the West is going to hit someone senior in Moscow, would it choose Dugin? I'm not sure it
Not
would.
a chance. No way. If they were going to be, if they had the ability to carry out car bombings in or right around Moscow and wanted to have that kind of an escalation, they would target the general chief of staff of the military. They would target Shoigu, the defense minister. They would target some official with actual power that can actually affect the balance of the war. The idea that Dugin or his daughter would be at the top of the target list strikes me as very implausible. I can't say impossible, but
Yeah.
implausible.
No, I agree with you. It's not out of the realms of impossibility. That's true, but it doesn't. I was thinking about this, and I mentioned to you before. I think Dugin, in some senses, plays an important role for the West as well to help caricature the Moscow leadership. I mean, he's so batshit crazy, forgive the
Absolutely.
language, that he really assists the Western kind of, and it's not a very hard job for them to criminalize and demonize the Moscow leadership as a crazy Nazi-like enemy. So that scenario doesn't really fit in. Another faction of kind of senior factions in Moscow hitting Dugin. If that's the case, and Putin was ignorant that that faction was going to hit Dugin like that, I think Putin would just, I don't think they would do it. Again, it doesn't quite make sense. Why would Putin allow a rogue faction to do this hit? I mean, Putin would just hit the roof, and that rogue faction would be in big trouble. So everything kind of points to Putin himself being at the root of this particular hit.
I have to agree. I, of course, am willing to entertain any possible theories, including ones that I didn't mention, but that I have to agree with your assessment. That makes the most sense. Now, I want to back up before we go really deep into the weeds here in terms of the Dugin networks and whatever. I don't necessarily mean each and every individual, though we could probably rattle off all of these assholes. I think that what we really need to understand backing up is the actual impact that Dugin has had, because we just mentioned ideologically it's imperial revanchism, that he's been agitating for war with Ukraine since, as you noted, since at least 2008. Obviously, it goes back well before that too. Um, Dugin and Dugin's networks that had been created were instrumental in launching the 2014 phase of this war in Ukraine. And that aspect of this really needs to be understood as well. If you think that Dugin is just some ideologue traveling around in Moscow and he's been targeted for his ideas, then you're missing one of the key elements of what Dugin did. Dugin and his networks are the reason those far right Nazis from Russia and from other parts of Europe went into Donbass in 2014 as supposed volunteers for Novorossiya, right, which is the Russian imperial name for that region. The initial phase of the war in Donbass was created to some extent on the Russian side by Dugin's networks and their recruitment efforts, bringing Nazis and fascists and others from all, and traditionalists and czarist monarchists and all of these crazies from all over Russia and elsewhere in Europe, the Middle East, and elsewhere, bringing them into Donbass and essentially helping to manufacture that phase of the war. So when we're talking about the 8 years between 2014 and 2022, we're talking about an aspect of this conflict for which Dugin was a centerpiece.
Absolutely. I mean, the interesting nuance in all of this is that Dugin and his industry were actually really close to the Azov battalion, the far right battalion, which is embedded obviously in the Ukrainian armed forces now, who've been at the vanguard of fighting back Russia's invasion occupation. And all those
and
far
which
right.
they now use to legitimize the idea that all Ukrainians are Nazis. Convenient how that worked out for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And, all the Banderists, the Azov Battalion, all the far right people who weren't necessarily Moscow oriented, who were perhaps quote unquote non-aligned at the time. Dugin was working directly with in his red brown racket. I think Ukraine is like is like the real. It's the central kind of living space, the Lebensraum. For the Moscow leadership, obviously, it goes back into kind of the ancient politics of the genesis of the Russian entity starting in Kiev Rus, which is modern day Ukraine, and Putin's whole justification in launching his war in February this year was that it was all Lenin's fault. It was all the Bolsheviks' fault. So again, you go back to this kind of blaming the kind of quote unquote Jewish Bolshevik, this kind of reaching back to this kind of overt Nazi nonsense. But in terms of Putin's politics, it is the fault of Lenin and the Bolsheviks. and what Putin blames as the Bolsheviks' right to self-determination of nations. It was, the Bolsheviks created this false reality of Ukrainianism that now needs to be negated. And it's probably the most important war for Dugin, definitely, for the Russian state to be involved in. And I think, obviously, for a revanchist as well, successful military operations is just, is the thing that they get off on most. So it's that establishing by force, the reconstruction of the Russian Empire. So, I mean, the thing is, there is NATO expansionism. We can't deny that there is, but it becomes very awkward when you talk about it in relation to the war in Ukraine, because it doesn't quite fit into the Russian narrative and justification for its actions in relation to its invasion and occupation of Russia. But we can't say that there is no NATO expansionism. There is. And the NATO expansionism, be it Putin or any other leadership in Moscow, would feel insecure in relation to NATO and what it's doing in the world. But I think what's happened is that Putin was probably dizzy with success from his Crimea operation in 2014. Then he rolls into his military intervention, a very kind of classically war on terror framework in entering into the Syria war as well. Very racist, pushing back the Islamic hordes, defending the great ancient civilized Phoenician civilization, which is Syria, the great white civilization as well, which Mimi
which
Laham
is
would remind us of as well.
which
Um,
plays right into their idea, the idea of the whole concept of Dugin's sort of revanchism, which is that Moscow is the third Rome. Moscow is the defender of Christendom, the true defender of Christendom, which is, as we of course understand, a sort of more palatable way of saying the defender of whiteness, the
yeah,
defender of white supremacy, of white Europe, right? And that is a defender of white civilization and of Christendom against not only the dark skinned Muslim hordes and all of the others, but also the transgendered liberals, the gays, the sort of liberal totalitarianism of the US hegemonic West, right? So that plays into the entire framework that they operate with.
yeah, and the weaponization of the creation of migration flows, and then the weaponization of those migration flows as a direct result of your war. I mean, it's really sick politics, but it's this classic far right stuff. So in line with that, they weaponized the refugee flows out of the Syria war and the other refugees from the global south from who are using that route, then to weaponize that and to weapon and instrumentalize that to create a far right movement within the West, which they can ally with. I mean, it's all quite.
And remember, I know you and I are talking about it so quickly because this is like old hat for us, but I just want to remind people that part of the way that they did that, which is also classically fascist, is that in 2015 and 2016, one of the primary lines of argument from the Duginists was that the wave of refugees and migrants that were flowing into Europe out of the Middle East, out of South Asia, out of sub-Saharan Africa, that was being orchestrated, and not only orchestrated by George Soros and the global rootless cosmopolitan Jew. You see that Soros and Soros's Open Society and organizations and all of this, constellation of nonprofits and everything was actually part of a broader conspiracy to destabilize and undermine Europe with dark-skinned peoples from other parts of the world. So it again folds us right back into the classic sort of Nazi conspiracy theorizing about the rich and powerful Jew pulling the strings on behalf of whatever, right, to destroy Europe, to destroy whiteness. I mean, it's no different than the protocols, really.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, George Soros. I mean, he's no friend of any anti-imperialist in the world. He represents the liberal wing of imperialism and finance capital and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, you're right. He just George Soros just fits the place of the global Jewish banker, quote unquote, for the Putin and Dugin camp. This constant trying to,
Code word, exactly.
yeah,
Code
just
word.
just just trying to bring back what's 21st century anti-Semitism. It's just, I mean, a lot of it is quite blatant anyway. I mean, they say globalists. and the bankers, etc. I mean, our old friend Caleb Maupin, who's in a little bit of a sticky scandal himself in this last few hours, being exposed as a predator on vulnerable teenage young people and manipulating them and impoverishing them and then sexually abusing them. Anyway, whatever. Someone like Caleb Maupin, who comes from a former Marxist background, enters the Dugin camp, becomes a big-time grifter in that camp, then endorses and adopts this language himself. So he constantly talks about the bankers, the bankers, the bankers. I mean, we're Marxists. We understand this as finance capital, the historic merger of bank and industrial capital. I mean, we can rationalize it in a scientific way. But yeah, this bringing back this old Nazism, old wine in new bottles kind of strategy. So yeah, so. But going back to the hit on Dugin, things are becoming very awkward. The Dugin project doesn't serve the role it once did when RT was riding high. It used the Libya war to become very popular. Uh, that's all going on. So what's the role? What's the purpose?
Opposition to the NATO war in Libya, by the way, was one of the two primary vehicles through which RT scooped up many leftists who ultimately ended up on that platform, including me and including you. It was at least for me, it was the coverage of Libya and the coverage of Occupy Wall Street, both of which, were
Mm.
central to justifying RT in my mind as a leading platform through which we could get our politics into a broader forum. And of course, by what you were describing, by 2015, 2016, it became clear that RT was not what that was, and that media project didn't exist for us and wasn't a platform that would help us. And if anything, it was one that was designed to, as you say, broaden the scope and scale of this kind of red brown Duginist politics.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like for someone like myself, who's born in India and is a migrant to the West here in London, I've always been really sensitive to the central role of migration in global radical working class and anti-imperialist socialist politics. So when this camp and this Duginist industry start to primarily target and demonize migrants, it's just something that naturally came to me like this is unacceptable, this is alarming, and we have to push back on this. You can't have an anti-imperialism that's woven into racist, anti-migration, white supremacy. It just negates anti-imperialism and takes it off into a divergent route into at the very minimum fascist collaboration, if not just becoming just adopting far right tropes and frameworks oneself. So I had to totally reject that. It's just a shame and perhaps indication of the balance of forces that railing against us. That at the time that we took that position in 2015, going to 2016, Eric, that so few people actually stood on that right anti-fascist, anti-racist politics and campaigned against where this anti-migration politics is coming from. It was literally just a handful of us who stood up against that. You can still be anti-imperialist and still oppose the politics of white supremacy and far-right politics from wherever it comes from. And the fact that people didn't stand up has just created so much political mess, and it still is creating actually a lot of political mess. But that camp is now falling apart at the seams because 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 the Russian war on Ukraine was justified in such a immoral way, in such a political way that has no justification whatsoever. I mean, they're saying Ukrainians don't exist. The Ukrainian nation don't exist. Ukrainians don't exist, and we're going to do to Ukraine what Israel does to Palestine, what US and Britain do to Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan. It's the exact same framework. It's the same ideological framework of going to war, and it's the same MO, it's the same modus operandi in conducting the war on the ground. So again,
Sukant, to your point, I wrote an article when this war began for Counterpunch called The Kremlin Goes Neocon. I mean, they were following the Bush Cheney playbook for Iraq almost to a T with regard to Ukraine, right? One day it's the threat of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction and biolabs. The next day it's about radical extremism in the Iraq context. It's Al Qaeda in the Ukraine context. It's Azov Battalion, right? It's step by step copying the neocon playbook. And unfortunately, or fortunately or unfortunately, that's actually pretty par for the course as far as the Russians go. The Russians were on board with the war on terror from, the 12th of September of 2001, so in fact, it really, if anything, kind of brings full circle much of the Russian policy vis-a-vis Bush Cheney, and Iraq.
Yeah, these are really important points. I think, listen, the I think a lot of people who are spinning the Russian state currently as some kind of anti-imperialist global vanguard need to remind themselves that the Soviet Union collapsed and the Russian state, which replaced Soviet socialism or the Soviet state, is one that was largely a creation of the leading Western states. That's what it was, and that's what it, in a lot of political senses, it remains. Um, you remember the looting that happened under the administration of Boris Yeltsin, the looting of the Russian people's assets, etc., that happened under him. What happens under Putin is a relative stabilization from the Yeltsin era, but the politics remain the same. And the only thing that really changes is because of the nature of global capitalism, of imperialism. It seeks monopoly, and it just has no room to admit Russia into its club, which Putin always wanted. Putin always wanted to be, including to very recently, probably including even now, Putin will go for it. If the West say, "I'll just come in, you're in the fold now," Putin will probably say, "Oh, thank God, mummy and daddy, finally you've accepted me." Um, but the only thing that changed, NATO and imperialism said, look, we're not going to allow you in the club. Actually, you're a competitor that we're going to push back. And if you don't say what we would say, if you don't go along with our looting, you're not going to be in our club, and we're going to increase conflict with you. Now that's happened, but the politics of the Russian state has stayed the same throughout the Chechen war, the second Chechen war. Putin was really clear, like, look, we're just doing to Chechnya what you guys are doing to Iraq and Afghanistan. There's no difference here. The racism, the neocon nature of the war, arguably even the Zionist nature of the politics of the Russian state is there. You can be an anti-imperialist and still oppose NATO, and at the same time deal with the realm of politics primarily and push back against this white supremacy and this Western exceptionalism that's been kind of internalized by the Moscow leadership in an asymmetric way.
I want to make a point, Sukan, about what you were talking about, and just bring in a little bit of my own personal experience. I lived in Russia in 1993 and 1994. My father was in a very senior position with respect to business dealings there. Senior position meaning that he managed a very large joint venture that included a business hotel there. Anyway, the point is that he was involved at very high levels with former Soviet, now Russian officials at that point. And the way that my father, and just to be clear, my father and I have 180-degree diametrically opposed political views. So I'm not suggesting that he's correct on everything, but his personal account of this is true, that by 1994, once several years had passed after the official collapse of the Soviet Union, the positions of power within the business sphere had begun to be assumed by former KGB and other former Soviet intelligence and other officials, including people like Putin. So when Putin rises to power, ultimately 1999, 2000, it needs to be seen as the consolidation of a whole period in which the former ruling class in the Soviet Union, that is to say, state bureaucrats at high levels in the intelligence, etc., had consolidated their control with Putin at the head. The creation of the oligarch class happens during this period. Putin needs to be understood as also the consolidation of a period of not only looting by the West, which it was, right? Plenty of Western entrepreneurs, investors, speculators, scoundrels came to Russia to make money, to asset strip, to do all of the things that, we all know that they did. And simultaneously, their collaborators were KGB, former KGB operators, former Soviet state bureaucrats who also sought to enrich themselves. So, in understanding how the Putin sort of what's called the sistema, right, the Russian word for system, right, the political organization of the Russian state came to be as a result of that consolidation of power by these KGBchniks, as you might call them.
I agree with all of that. So the question arises: when did, and I mean, I was part of this as well, to make self-criticism, but when did certain leftists think that the Moscow regime is then somehow on their side globally, which is really interesting to analyze, right? What? Because I remember, I come from a Stalinist political background myself, and through the late '90s, we'd denounce the Russian leadership as being pro-West, pro-capitalist, totally counter-revolutionary and reactionary, and that changes. And it's really interesting. When did that change, and exactly how? I think perhaps it changed because of the relative um, resurgence of the global South in that whole um, Chavez, Morales kind of wave that we had that allied with Gaddafi and Ahmadinejad. And that period was circa, what, 2005, 2006, to just before the Arab Spring or the Arab Sting in 2010. And because China bankrolled a lot of the changes, like in Latin America, with the so-called "quote unquote" pink tides. Good hundreds of billions of dollars were invested by the Chinese in the pink tide governments, and I suppose this relative resurgence of the global South, which is also predicated on the victories of the Iraqi resistance, by the way, which bogged down imperialism into the Iraqi arena, so other elements of the world could rise, not least Russia and China, and the quote unquote BRICS as well. 20 years on from the BRICS, where does that whole project lie at the moment in a very shabby situation, I would argue. So I think things change. Putin is seen by a section of the anti-imperialist left as something positive in this period, and then you have very quickly the emergence of Russia Today, which along with its connected cottage industries, creates this globally financed movement, which then puts money into the pockets of all of those far right conspiracy nuts, the anti-globalization movement, railing against the globalists. And we saw this, throughout from the '90s onwards. I remember at university in the early 2000s, being alarmed that most of my student activist friends, we did a lot of anti-imperialist, socialist, radical work, were actually admirers of David Icke, who was also part of the whole Alex Jones and his comrades with Alex Jones. This whole industry gets a bigger platform and gets financed by the Dugin global racket, and including, we're going on these platforms as well and getting a bit of pocket money as well. It becomes really corrupting. It did, and I have to admit that in terms of employing my own self-criticism, it does become corrupting. I ended up spinning the Russian intervention in Syria as good. I wasn't that bothered about Russian intervention in Crimea. It's just not exactly the aesthetic of the politics that I'm interested in, although I do take an interest. Um, but anyway, so I started spinning the Russian leadership as good, but they were manipulating all the time. They did nothing for the Libyans during the Libya war, absolutely sat on their hands, used it then to become like more popular. And to this day, the Putin leadership has given nothing to the Libyans since the war. It backed the old CIA Haftar, CIA man, General Haftar in the east, and then it's brought in its Wagner mercenaries to kill innocents in Sirte and other places. I mean, it's given the Libyans nothing, and then utilized the Libya war to intervene in Syria, to argue, well, we can't let happen to Syria what happened to Libya, so we got to go in. But has used Syria, has partitioned Syria, invited Western imperialist bombing along with it. They coordinated for years. Putin and the Western states had telephone calls to avoid touching each other. Generally, in the Syria war, partition the north. Putin rejects the Kurds, then does deals with Erdogan now. I mean, it's a total mess. And the Syrian nationalists can't say anything because they're totally beholden to Putin's patronage, and also corrupted by their own messy far right politics themselves. So it's very sad to see what role Putin has played in Syria while posturing as a savior for Syrians. It's really, really sad stuff.
Let's talk a little bit about Europe. Dugin's networks, and I just want to return the conversation to Dugin specifically, since we're talking about it in the context of this assassination. Dugin's networks targeted Europe more than I think any other place, including the United States. Dugin's networks targeted Europe in ways to try to exploit the already existing divisions. We know several of the operatives who have since faced legal problems. Manuel Oxenreiter, who was somebody who attempted to recruit me into the Dugin network, he's now dead, but he had legal problems stemming from an assassination attempt and possibly a terrorist connection. He was one of Dugin's main operatives in Europe. He was the editor of a Duginist publication in Germany that was basically, I don't know, what would you call it? It was basically as close to being pro-Nazi as you can be legally in Germany. And similarly in Poland, another guy named Sikorsky, who was one of Dugin's operatives, who also has faced legal problems. These two were primary organizers for the so-called observer missions to Donbass in 2014 that many have written about, right? Where you had these recruitment efforts, including some of those people that are now the most prominent Duginists, including your Twitter pal Kevork Elmassian, who was recruited by these same people. You have prominent YouTubers, prominent Twitter personalities, and others who are now running and scurrying and hiding because these connections to Dugin and to Russian intelligence and to this fascist politics, it's all out in the open, baby.
Yeah, I think when Russia Today was still on our channels on TV, when that whole industry was doing quite well and people are getting paid and it's feeding their narcissism and their pockets, it's all right. But when things get, I mean, I'm sorry to kind of paraphrase Stalin in this regard. I mean, I think Stalin is a very problematic figure, but he said, he says, when the revolution is on the up, everyone wants to be a revolutionary. It's fashionable, it's easy. When the revolution is on the down, that's everyone kind of like runs away, like rats escaping a sinking ship. And I think for the global fascist revolution, which was the Dugin campaign, when things are on the up, it's all great. They're all full of swagger and arrogance. They're getting paid. It's funding their lives. But when that not only has the racket, i.e., the industry collapsed, but the morals, the immorality of it all, you know, all the just the nasty, just toxic politics of it all has come out in direct relation to the Ukraine war. There is no moral high ground anymore, As anti-imperialists, we have the moral high ground constantly because we're fighting the greatest purveyors of violence, of organized violence in the world, to paraphrase Dr. King. We always have the moral high ground. We support the oppressed in a universalist project of human liberation and defending the planet. These guys, it's just white supremacy, racism, rewashing far right tropes, and trying to manipulate people into agreeing with it. So it's not going to work. When it comes to someone like, I think Kevork, you mentioned a couple of people in Germany. Kevork Messian is an interesting character because I remember back in 2015 actually, I just checked my inbox. I had a private conversation with Kevork, who was sent to Germany. So as far as I understand it, he's a Syrian asylum seeker in Germany, applying for asylum. Is that correct?
I believe Armenian background, Syrian
All
Armenian
right. So his Armenian
heritage
heritage from Syria, claiming asylum in Germany.
in Germany,
I mean,
correct?
it's rather disgusting, isn't it? Considering how much the migration issue and demonizing
Yeah.
migrants played into their political project and
And
still
just
does.
and just to be clear, I'm not bringing up these individuals to point out like, okay, let's spend 30 minutes talking about this irrelevant jerk, but like I mean to say that there are these people who either were recruited or in other ways roped into being part of this network that do still have followers on social media, that do still have influence within these circles, that do still play a role in all of this. And so it's important that we understand that as Dugin himself is targeted and his networks are targeted, that these type of people, they need to be known for what they are.
No, absolutely. It is important. And I think, it was years that we were trying to bring people's attention to Dugin and his agenda and his work. But now, because of the Ukraine war, you go on social media and lots of people are onto it now as well. So a lot of people
And
are gone.
to that point, I think it's important that we stress that for years and years, these issues were laughed at. I was laughed at when I would bring up these issues by some people that I used to consider close politically. I was laughed at. I was told that Dugin is irrelevant both in Russia and internationally. I was told that to talk about these issues is to be essentially deliberately sowing discord among anti-imperialist camps and all sorts of nonsense, right? So for years and years, these elements have attempted to play all of this off as irrelevant. Actually, I should point out, I did an interview with a really, really interesting Russian Marxist just after the war began, and we were talking about various issues, and I brought up Dugin, and he laughed because in Russia, Dugin is seen as some kind of an Alex Jones like conspiracy theorizing kind of crank. But internationally, Dugin's project had tentacles in a lot of different places and, fingers in a lot of different pies, as it were. And for us to have been talking about this for 7, 8 years and to have been sort of told that these are marginal issues, and now that we have Dugin's fantasy war become a reality, and Dugin's central ideas become Russian state policy, now all of a sudden there is a feeling of, gee, we've been talking about this for quite a while.
Yeah, well, we do try and kind of stay on top of things, and sometimes, we get it right, and sometimes we don't get it quite right. But I think you've been involved in this for decades. I've been involved in this for 27 plus years, and despite any mistakes you might make going along the way, we're serious, we're committed, we're considered. We try to employ seeking truth from facts and proper social investigation and treating these things like a science. And yeah, and I like to think that we're ahead of the curve often and frequently as well. And definitely in this regard, I think that's been the case. I mean, it's come, like you said, with a lot of grief and a lot of ridicule at times, but that's just the way it is in certain historical junctures in history. That if the balance of forces are rained against us, if you stand on the moral high ground in the interest of uh, uh, human resistance and liberation, you're going to be sidelined to a certain extent. But look what's happened. These things will always come back to bite these people. If you stand on such corrupt, unethical, trashy politics, it will come back to bite you. It's inevitable. I think I just mentioned Kavol Kelmassian because I reached out to him privately to say, why are you in Germany working with AFD? And he's like, no, AFD are good people, you're wrong. I'm like, no, they're not. It's a far right operation that's criminalizing migrants. At which point Kavol blocks me straight away. So it was really clear.
AFD being the Alternative for Deutschland political party, which is the far right party that is a mainstream major political actor in Germany. Go ahead, Sukant.
Yeah, I mean, again, like, being committed to migrant communities in Europe, this was just wholly alarming for me, and I end up getting really, very confrontational with the Duginists, and I play upon their fears on migration. I say to them, I hope you're in a dark alley somewhere in Germany or in Europe, and some migrant stabs you. If you really think we're an existentialist, violent threat to your white cultural order, well, hey, we're not. Yeah, well, there's an argument to be had that we are not loyal to your white cultural order. That there is truth in that. I mean, the far right, they play on seeds of truth, don't they? They always do, to kind of promote their nonsense. Then absolutely right. Yes, we've come here and we're not going to respect racism. We're not going to respect the racist state. And migrant working class people throughout the West have been the most radical component part of the working class struggle for obvious reasons, that they're the most oppressed section, and we're going to push back. And there's a few other characters. I think Redfish is really important in all of this. Redfish presents itself as a radical left platform, established and run by Elizabeth Cocker or Lizzie Phelan, depending what name she wants to go as, a former comrade of mine. We used to work together 10 years ago. And Redfish was actually an admission of the Dugin camp that they're losing followers because of their advocacy around the migration crisis. So Redfish starts as a platform to try and recoup radical leftists back into the Dugin racket. And again, with Redfish, although it's very manipulative, more and more people are catching on to the fact that, hold on a second, who is this and what is this? You know, when it comes to our radical politics, Eric, and trying to promote it in the world, if a radical left politics is really, really popular and has hundreds of thousands of shares and stuff, you have to step back and think, hold on, what's going on? Because the fact is, our politics isn't that massively popular at this historical juncture. And if there is what seems to be a radical left platform that's very popular, then the central things that you have to ask yourself is, are they fighting organized racism on the planet today in an overt and direct manner? And that has to include the Dugan Bannon, Putin, Trump project. Just going back
And
to
there's no question. Just to be clear, there's no question about redfish. This isn't speculation. We know from people who were there at the first meetings where the money came from. That it came from the Russian government. This was part of the whole project. There's no question. There's a reason why Twitter labeled them Russian state media funded, or whatever whatever the label is that they use. Right? There's the reason for that is because these links are not speculative. These are well established and understood. These are subsidiaries of the Kremlin propaganda project, whether they're catering to the far right or to the far left or to the extreme center or whatever it might be. The Russian propaganda project has been, to a large extent, exposed.
Yeah, absolutely, and and it's played. Redfish has played a problematic role in radical left politics in London. A lot of the radical left activists in London, a lot of them end up getting financed by Redfish for their media projects, and that really just skews the whole orientation of the radical left. Actually, it just neutralizes it basically because it just kind of swerves it into a dead end, which is informed by its funding source. But a lot, like I said, a lot of this whole camp is falling apart at the seams, and it's really important that people like us try to attempt to fill in the gap of explaining to people who are these people, because they operate on deceit and manipulation constantly, and we can see that now. What's been exposed by Caleb Maupin. I mean, someone like Caleb Maupin can become a little bit of a mover and shaker. I mean, it's really indicative of the pathetic state of affairs. Um, and
Yeah, I mean these people are a joke. But to your point about self criticism, I think one element, I think one thing that demonstrates how the Duganists were able, and the Russian state generally, because it's not, the Duganists are not the only element within the Russian propaganda apparatus. So I think we should be clear that Russian propaganda is far larger and far of a far greater scope than just the Duganists and their networks, right? They are one branch of it, I think we could say. But they're the branch that reached directly into left wing anti-imperialist circles, which is how we had these sort of experiences with them. But in any event, the issue, I think, well, damn it, I just lost my train of thought.
uh,
But the point I want to make is that Russian propaganda has, to a large extent, been exposed out in the open. A lot of these ideas that they've been promoting for a long time, including the buzzwords multipolarity, multipolar world order, these type of things, these have to be understood as coded language for Russia's political project. We've seen this over and over again, just as you mentioned earlier with the BRICS, or with the so-called Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or the Eurasian Economic Union, and all of these supposed multilateral non-Western institutions that Russia was central in creating. None of them amount to anything because
yeah,
they're all simply part of Russia's propaganda. They're
so,
not actually part of building an alternative to Western hegemonic imperialism or
exactly.
global finance capital or anything like that.
Exactly. I mean, another leading Duginist, Tim Anderson. I see what in the work he's doing that because he's doing on social media currently. For him and the entire like the more kind of the Duginists who think they're left wing, how are they going to sell this project to people and the rest of the world? How are they going to sell it to the southern continents, to the people of the global south? So what they're doing is exactly what you're saying. That they're trying to say, look, Putin is the vanguard leader globally of forging a new multipolar world. And this is where your salvation lies, is at the feet of Putin, who's gonna who's gonna deliver you to the promised land of ending Western hegemony. You're saying, oh, okay, well, okay, let's interrogate that a little bit more closer now. Um, hmm, right. Does the Kazakh working class uprising of January and Russian armed forces crushing it, is that the new great brave world that we want? Hmm. Is the Russian intervention in Libya or Mali or Sudan with its mercenaries and leeching the natural resources of these African states the great new multipolar world that we want? No, no, it's not. This unfortunately, I wish it was the case. I wish the BRICS were the harbingers of the liberated humanity that I thought they might be 15, 20 years ago. And the BRICS did indicate some kind of shift away from Western hegemony. It didn't say that it wasn't totally not that, but then now Brazil has had a fascist leadership for years. India has a fascist leadership for years. South Africa is in a total mess with even Thabo and Becky 2 weeks ago saying, well, the masses of South Africa might rise up now against the level of corruption and failure of the ANC state there. It's just clearly not what's being shown and proven very clearly to the people of the world that Russia and China are not actually offering some kind of pro human liberation counter opposite world order, but actually due to the political and ruling classes of their state and the nature of their state, all they want to do is replace the West and stand in for the West, retain the colonial capitalist world framework, and just become the new players in that. And that has nothing to do with what we need in terms of the environment emergency and the emergency for working class people across the world. That's very much to do with the exploitation of the environment and generally the capitalist crisis happening in the world. So going back to the people who are blindly promoting Beijing and Moscow as the saviors for everything in the world, it puts them in a really awkward position where they have to just pretend reality is something else to try and manipulate us into siding with their camp. I mean, it's really sad and tragic what's happened. And every hour and every day, their shtick, their deceit and manipulation is collapsing because people of the world are saying what you're saying is just not true. And there's only so much you can do by buying people's political loyalty. Okay, comrade, here's $200 in your pocket every 2 weeks. Be in our camp. That's not going to win everyone over.
I think one important point here, Sukant, that needs to be drawn out, and I realize this conversation is going long, but we're whatever. The I think that we have to remember that part of the Duginist strategy has always been, and it continues to be, to present themselves as the only authentic anti imperialism, and that those that do not fall into their camp and do not see the world the way that they do are actually witting or unwitting agents of US imperialism, right? So there's only Duginist, red brown anti imperialism on the one hand, or pro US, pro CIA, pro NATO imperialism on the other hand. And if you're a leftist, you have to choose. Make your choice. Stand side by side and shoulder to shoulder with these Nazi fucks, or stand side by side and shoulder to shoulder with these CIA scum, right? And that there's no, that there's nothing else, that nothing else under the sun, right? That is the framework that they promote because they understand that if you're a genuine leftist and a genuine anti-imperialist, you're never going to see yourself as siding with Washington, with the CIA, with the British, with MI6 or the rest of it. And at the same time, you're not going to side with these Nazi scum.
What can I? Yeah, I agree with you. Absolutely spot on that. Got nothing else to add to what you've said, really, Eric. Um, Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I think as that red brown camp crumbles and falls apart at the seams, it does potentially leave an opening. But I think people spontaneously are filling that gap as well, as far as I can see on social media. People don't want imperialist hegemony. People don't want imperialist bullying. A lot of people don't want that, and they want that struggle against imperialism and that trashy politics from wherever it comes from the world to be defeated. And so it is interesting to see this whole thing is falling apart, and people are trying to fill in the gaps, and they are to a certain extent. But however, the challenges remain great because until really we have a new popular movement and ideally a new radical people state that's able to give leadership to this, countering this whole mess is going to not go very far at all, because as we're countering it, as it's falling apart on the one hand, actually, and so it brings me back to the earlier part of the conversation, that the trashy politics of the far right are still really powerful in the West, not least in the USA, where you have an insurgent far right movement that might capture the government again within 2 years. So, in the case of the United States, in a way, the Putin Dugin camp has really completed its project there. They've got their guy and they've got their movement where they want it in the USA. In some
And they
part,
don't have to direct it anymore.
well,
The movement
exactly,
has a life of its own.
it has its life of its own. And Putin sends Viktor Orban to the CPAC conference last week. So they're really explicit in terms of their joint enterprise as well. It's not hidden, it's not manipulated. Bam, there's our guy in Europe, this Nazi leader of Hungary. He's with Putin, he's with Trump, and he's speaking at the CPAC conference. Done. It's a little bit more challenging for them in Europe, and that's why they're trying to use the Ukraine war in this push-pull strategy with that's Russia on the one hand and Europe on the other hand. They're trying to utilize Ukraine war in relation to Europe.
I want to ask you a question. This is one that has been, I think, well, it's been wrestled with by many over the last 6 months, but I think that in some ways, much of the discussion is somewhat misguided or dishonest. So I'm going to ask you your opinion. And just to be clear, and probably should have said this earlier, Sukant, you and I don't always see 100% eye to eye on everything. We have differences of opinion on historical issues. We have differences of opinion on left traditional issues and what have you. So I don't want to present Sukhan and I as 100% simpatico on everything, but I do think it is important to get your perspective on this question. And this relates to all of the Dugin stuff that we've been talking about. Is Russia engaging in an imperialist, neo-colonial war in Ukraine? And why is answering that question A, so important, and B, so difficult for some segments of the left, given what we know about the Red Browns and Dugin and all of the rest of that? So is Russia's war in Ukraine a neo-colonial, neo-imperialist war? Why is the understanding of this question critical, and how are the Duginists and others allied to them distorting that issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's within Putin and Dugin's own discourses. It's a revanchist war to reestablish the Russian Empire. So it's literally, it's empire building in that regard. So that they're not hiding that. In terms of its neo-colonial nature, the periphery. I mean, we have to you have to understand ancient politics to understand the reality today. There's one, I think, from China. There's one argument that there's not even a concept of history. There is no history. History is today, and today is history. The genesis of the Russian state is a colonial one. I mean, how did it start in Kiev Rus and expand all the way across the Asian landmass? It colonized, and it definitely sees Ukraine as a false entity, a falsely constructed one that's done by the Bolsheviks. So it wants to recoup that in a colonizing mission. The politics is of neo-colonialism and imperialism. The modus operandi is of neo-colonialism and of an imperialism. But where this conversation is awkward and becomes a very difficult one is because of anti-imperialism in the sense that we oppose the greatest alliance of imperialists in the world, which is not Russia actually, and it's not the Moscow Beijing axis, if you want to call that. But I wouldn't call that because there's a lot of issues between Beijing and Moscow, which we probably won't go into right now. It's not the biggest imperialist entity. NATO and the Western states are. So I think that's where, to give some people the credit on the left, they find this really awkward, and some people don't want to go into that conversation, and because of the anxiety that we have to politically focus primarily on defeating Western imperialism, we can't then say, we can't use the words like colonialism and imperialism, etc., in relation to Russia. But I counter that by saying, listen, as revolutionaries against imperialism and white supremacy and from socialism, we deal not only in geopolitics. Actually, we don't just deal in geopolitics. If you only deal in narrow geopolitics, you will get your politics all messed up, and it'll become very trashy very quickly. We deal in the realm of politics, culture, and philosophy, and in that realm, it's a reactionary war. It's again Putin saying, and his leadership saying, like, if you can do these things to Iraq and Afghanistan, why can't we? And they're saying that in a positive way. We have a right to do this to Ukraine and Kazakhstan and whoever else that we want, and Syria, because you do it. So it's a mirroring. It's a total mirroring. So in the realm of politics, you have to oppose it. Now, I've lost a few comrades because of the Ukraine war, and it's to do with them, with them just not coming to terms with the fact. I think two main things. One, that Moscow is involved in a global joint enterprise of global fascist revolution. That's the reality taking place, and they don't want to see it, because if they did see it, then it really for them problematically intervenes and breaks down the framework that the war on Ukraine is actually an anti-imperialist one. Actually, it's an historic, it's a major historic struggle between imperialism and anti-imperialism, and really its outcome. This is their argument, not mine. The outcome of the war will determine whether we have an imperialist free world or a world dominated by Western imperialism. Now, I think all of that is just a absolutely wrong-headed framing of the entire issue. So yeah, to answer your point.
It's an abandonment of all of the core principles and values that actually make up anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, anti-racism, all of these issues that are supposed to form the bedrock of our politics. And so in a sense, you find these, as you said, extremely awkward arguments. I would say really kind of laughable ones, where they want to well, actually, if you read Lenin, The Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, and you quote from page 126, you'll see that actually what Russia is doing is fundamentally different from what Lenin was describing as imperialism. Therefore, it's not an imperialist war. Therefore, it's not colonialist. And actually, you work for the CIA. So shut the fuck up, right? Like, that is kind of some of the kind of argumentation you see. But in fact, as you noted earlier, the war was launched on explicitly anti-communist ideology, right? On an explicitly, it's probably, I can't even think of another more explicitly anti-communist war. Maybe the US war in Vietnam, perhaps, explicitly anti-communist war.
Hey,
I mean,
Eric, we haven't had a war against communism for a long time.
yeah, hey, great. So, Uncle Vlad can launch a war against communism for us, But on the eve of the war, when Putin made his big speech and he talked about Lenin and the Bolsheviks and whatever, he made the explicit case that this was a war to essentially right the historical wrong of the Bolsheviks. Okay, and so for those people on the left to justify this war, it's not only awkward, it's actually extremely treacherous move and a total abandonment of all of the principles that we're supposed to be abiding by, including the fact that anti-imperialism and anti-colonial politics is supposed to always side with the oppressed, those people that are being invaded by their larger neighbor. Anti-imperialists don't make a habit of supporting the larger invader against the smaller and weaker country being invaded. Okay, this is a very basic principle that, again, if you apply it in any other context, would be obvious and self-evident. And yet, in the Ukraine context, it's like you got to explain these things.
No, I agree. It's very tragic and sad to see that people adopting the politics of that red brown camp then Even comrades that I would respect and even who mentored me for years, end up just choosing not to see really ugly things in their camp, not least racist and the far right. So you go back to 2016 when I stuck my neck out and denounced the whole far right project to do with migration coming out of Russia Today. On Russia Today itself, I received this whole big campaign of death threats by the global far right. And then you had a long-standing comrade and political associate of mine, Carlos Martinez, standing with the far right, death threats against me. This is, I mean, just the point being just to indicate, if you adopt the politics of that camp, you're going to have to start justifying, you know, neo-Nazis and racists and far right, and we can give you endless examples and evidence to them doing that, all the time. How can you stand shoulder to shoulder with David Duke? How can you stand shoulder to shoulder with Ken O'Keefe and all these other wacko?
Alex Jones.
I mean, but yeah, Alex Jones, but literally David Duke. David Duke was in London with Ken O'Keefe setting up a TV project supported by Press TV London, inviting me onto the bloody show, onto the program in 2010, 2011. I'm like, Ken O'Keefe, man, our politics are counter oppositional. What are you talking about? Again, I'm not going to go into a platform with David Duke, but you have leftists justifying this stuff. You have people who are self-proclaimed leftists having dinner parties with Mimi Laham and other far right people. You go into a camp that's full of really trashy politics. If you're going to stay in that camp, you're going to have to justify, or at the very least, what they usually do is pretend like these racists don't exist, to involve yourself in self-deception and project that self-deception as deceit and manipulation and straight out lies publicly. Is that what anti-imperialism is about? Is that what being a radical Marxist is about? I mean, no, it's a counter opposite. It's fascist collaboration. And you can go, I would really encourage people to go back to Mussolini and to read his political biography of once being a really radical Marxist, anti-imperialist. The guy spent 5 months in prison in 1911 opposing the Italian invasion and occupation of Libya. That's Benito Mussolini. By the time of the First World War, people have to go back to this history. It's very interesting. When Lenin denounces all of the Second International leaders for supporting their own imperialist governments in the imperialist war, very similar politics to the right-wing nationalism of what we see today, particularly in the West, of people adopting these far-right tropes and this racist politics. In the case of Brexit, the collapse of a lot of left-wing people into supporting Brexit, and supporting politics against immigration, it's all there. Once you enter into a political camp that has very unethical and reactionary politics, it's going to start degenerating your own ethics and politics as well.
Okay, we have about 8 minutes left, so let's wrap up our conversation here, Sukant. And I want to bring us back to the Dugin issue. Again, the assassination of his daughter may be potentially an assassination attempt on him. I think that's probably an easy leap to make. What do you think this ultimately means? What is the ultimate significance of this? Not in respects to the Dugin media networks and their projects. And again, just to reiterate, it's not just media projects. They operate nonprofit organizations, pseudo academic think tanks. They have contacts with publications in Europe, far right political parties, etc. So these networks are more than just the media projects that are their public facing, wing. But what is the significance, if any, of all of this in terms of the war in Ukraine, in terms of Russian politics? Maybe this requires assuming that it was carried out by Putin and Putin's people. But in any event, let's try to bring this back into its historic context, or maybe we could say contemporary historic context. Is this a turning point? A turning point for what? What is coming in the near future? And is this just a little blip on the radar, or does this have a significance beyond just this one particular woman being killed?
I think it indicates a growing problematic complexity for the Russian leadership carrying out its quote unquote special military operation, its war and occupation of Ukraine. It's getting more complex, it's getting more sticky for Putin. And I think it just indicates there's this more tension in his ruling factions. I mean, before the targeting of the Dugins, yes, last night, there's lots of reports saying that the factions circling around Putin are becoming more dissatisfied. They're bickering more, and that reflects that the Ukraine war has terribly, and I mean the word terribly, complicated the world situation for our politics as well. It's made a big mess of it. It's created a lot more confusion around it. But that aside, let's just leaving aside the problems of the Ukraine war for any potential of global South unity and liberation and anti-imperialist socialist politics. That aside, I think if we look at, I mean, you probably have followed this a lot more closer than I, so I should hand over to you. I would be interested to hear to your comments. But what I can see is that, notwithstanding, Russia has a lot of artillery to deploy in Ukraine, a massive amount. It does. And it seems that NATO is somewhat failing Ukraine in countering the Russian war. Nevertheless, on the Russian side, the war is not going the way they planned. It's not going smoothly. And that's most graphically, I think, shown by the attacks on Crimea by the Ukrainian armed forces. This is disastrous optics for Putin, and this is a disastrous development for Putin because he wants to be the shield of protection of Russians to annex territory for the Russian homeland, to fill it with Russian settlers, to be their shield of protection and prosperity. And all of that just absolutely collapses with Russians running away, with their families running away from their beach, literally with Ukrainian bombs just a few hundred meters away from them. The negotiation with Erdogan as well, the really awkward negotiations with Erdogan to do with the grain shipments, to do with Syria, etc., again shows Putin in not a strong position. He needs Erdogan. He doesn't want to show people he needs this guy, Erdogan, who's his main competitor in the Eurasian geopolitical sphere. It's Erdogan, who's in his own economic crises within Turkey, but nevertheless, Erdogan has the ability to use his global influence to try and protect him and trying to manipulate things in his own favor. So just to simplify, the war's not going Putin's way on a whole number of levels. It's becoming more complex. He's probably becoming nervous about things increasingly going forward. And I think probably, I mean, first of all, I don't even know how long Dugin's got to live. He might be dead in the next few hours or days or few weeks. There's a rumor he's been admitted into hospital. I don't know what's going to happen to him. But for the Ukraine war, it's probably going to become a lot more messier, and we're probably going to see two things happen at the same time: escalation of sorts, but also some reaching out from Moscow to have some kind of talks to start discussing, well, let's start kind of like winding this down now in some kind of ways. That's how I'm reading it. I'm sure I'm wrong to some extent, but what's your thoughts, Eric?
My read is similar, Sukant. I think that Putin was nervous potentially about somebody like Dugin chirping on his right as he enters into what I would argue would be probably the next phase of all of this, which would be, as you described, not necessarily a wind down, but a phase that sees that begins to formulate a path to an exit, right? Even if that path to an exit emerges within an escalation of the violence, which I think is likely. I do believe that Putin understands that although Russia can continue to withstand sanctions to some degree and has some sense of resilience economically, that ultimately over the long run, even if Europe is screaming in pain from energy prices, Russia is the one that faces potential collapse. And so with that in mind, I do believe that Putin is beginning to maneuver pieces into place to begin to try to wind this down, at least to some degree. And I don't think it was particularly convenient for Putin to have this guy out there saying basically every day that Putin has mismanaged, that Putin is a coward, that he needs to escalate, that he needs to consolidate, that he needs to carpet bomb Ukraine and whatever other kind of nonsense Dugin speaks.
Mhm.
So in one sense, I think that this is essentially let's call it clearing the board, right, of the elements on Putin's far right, of those elements that have some degree of global influence that could potentially um, force Putin to adjust some of his talking points. Okay, and to your point earlier, the idea that Dugin, sort of that Putin dances to Dugin's tune. I think Dugin thinks that to some degree, and I think that Putin not only was annoyed by that, but also can't have somebody like that out there, right? And maybe killing his daughter was a message. Maybe it was intended to kill him, but ultimately, I do believe that escalation and simultaneous de-escalation is what we're headed to. The problem for Putin, from my perspective, is that I don't see all that much desire on the Ukrainian side to make a deal right now. The Ukrainians are the ones with the momentum. The Ukrainians, although they're dying and suffering casualties in extremely high numbers, the morale is on their side, not on Russia's side. Despite what you see about opinion polls coming out of Russia, Ukrainian opinion polls seem to indicate a desire to fight this war until Crimea is back in Ukrainian hands, if you know what I mean. So the question really becomes, is the assassination of Dugin or Dugin's daughter maybe an indication from Russia to Ukraine and to others? Hey, look, it's time to get serious here. You start getting your elements on your right under
Mm.
control. I'll get the elements on my right under control. And maybe, just maybe, we can find a way out of this.
Yeah, I concur.
So we shall see. But Dugin's daughter being assassinated, either way, is a momentous occasion. It certainly marks something of an escalation, and it really does bring full circle so many of these things that have been going on for 8 years. And anybody who listened to 90 minutes of us talking about this, there's so much more to read about. Many have written on these subjects. I have written on it. You have spoken and written on it. You can go back to my pieces from 2017 talking about the various little organizations and individuals that sort of revolve around this Dugin network. All of that seems to be collapsing, and so what can I say other than they seem to be collapsing? Sukant, you and I are still here, and there is something delicious about all of that.
Nice one, brother. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Sukant. Thanks for chatting with us. Listeners, viewers, as always, thank you for the continued support. And of course, not every video I get to have a glorious guest like this to join me where we could talk for 90 minutes. I have plenty more shorter videos, 15 to 20 minutes, talking about all of the latest developments. How about the Ukrainians attacking the Wagner base, attacking these mercenaries on their own home soil? How about the Ukrainians bombing Crimea? How about the things going on in the Middle East, the grain shipments, so much more? I will have videos on all of that. Go over to patreon.com/Eric Draitser, subscribe on the YouTube channel, and I will talk to you all again next time.